Hello and what is up YouTube? My name is G3Iron and welcome to today's discussion where we are discussing your feedback and your suggestions and answers to a community poll and a community question that we put out a couple of days ago on YouTube. The question was, if you were to remove one thing from Path of Exile with the goal of making it more fun, what is that one thing that you would remove? If you are new to the community, you can of course like, subscribe, and ding the bell to be notified about future discussions just like this one. So without any further delay, let's jump into today's discussion and y'all's ideas about removing one thing to make PoE more fun. The first major point of consensus that multiple different players mentioned and community members mentioned was, of course, Flasks. I like the way how Chris D put it. He responded to the question, "This was a surprisingly thought-provoking question. After much thought, I think I'd settle on utility Flasks." Makino said, "Hard pick between Lab Trial and Flasks. I think Flasks I can't play with a jacked up hand." And there are several more comments on this particular thread that mention Flasks, whether they be in conjunction with other things or simply Flasks on their own, like Devin Johnson leaving behind just the comment, Flasks. You think about Flasks in an action RPG, essentially what you're getting at is you're getting at a temporary boost, right? A temporary solution to a problem or a temporary offensive output. The whole point of Flasks, at least in most action RPGs, or in general in most RPGs at all, is that it is a temporary and consumable item. Now, one of the things that's cool about Path of Exile's approach to Flasks is that they're not necessarily consumable in that if you use your flask too much, it's deleted from the game, right? We don't have hardcore flasks. Our flasks refresh as we kill monsters. But there is something to this nature of being a temporary buff that has simply been circumvented in the current state of Path of Exile. Flasks now are really an extension of your character, and you ought to have them up at all times. As soon as I say that, I'm sure there's going to be some of you out there who are furiously typing on your keyboards already. "Oh, but Iron, there's all kinds of builds that aren't flask dependent, and I don't even care about flasks or use flasks." Yes, there's always an exception to the rule, but nonetheless, the reality is players feel as though you're losing out on a significant opportunity for power to your character if you are not utilizing flasks on a semi-permanent basis. Flasks can kind of be like a Swiss Army knife of Path of Exile builds. They can round out, they can finish, they can fill in various gaps or various areas in your build that aren't being solved in other places. If you need elemental immunity, you can solve that with flasks. If you need a little bit more DPS, you can solve that with flasks. If you need some more survivability after you've taken a big hit, you can, in many cases, solve that with flasks. If you'd like to have better mitigation because there's an oncoming big hit on its way, you can solve that with flasks. If you want to have some utility and phasing and move quicker through packs or simply farm faster or progress faster through the 10-act story campaign, you can use flasks. Flasks in Path of Exile have this strange relationship with players in Path of Exile. On the one hand, mechanically, they are supposed to be temporary buffs. They are not supposed to be permanent. They are not supposed to be something like the passive tree or like a piece of gear that you equip it and you instantly have all of these various new stats, new abilities, and new mechanics available at your disposal. Yet, most builds nowadays take advantage of flasks as another semi-permanent thing. Sure, you've got to use your left hand or your right hand or whatever your keyboard configuration is. Maybe you've got your flask set up on a 20-button mouse. I don't know. The point is, flasks are supposed to be, in Path of Exile from a philosophy standpoint, something that provides a temporary boost, and they no longer feel that way. Original design philosophy was, hey, we're going to have something permanent in that your flask doesn't disappear like in other games where you've got to purchase annoying consumable flasks. We're going to do away with that in PoE. We're going to have permanent flasks, but the buffs that you get from them won't be permanent. They will be essentially on a timer and you'll need to refill your flask. That in and of itself is kind of a cool concept. And that, I feel like, actually nowadays, is actually better implemented with vol skills than it is with flasks. Think about it. It's something that's temporary. It's something that you can't always reliably have up. It's something where the game itself actually has restrictions about how often you can use it, essentially having cooldowns. You've got to really make whole builds and itemize in a particular way if you really just want to max out your refreshing ability of a vol skill. Well, that's kind of what the idea was with Flasks, at least in the original implementation of Flasks, and that is nowhere near where Flasks are at right now. Imagine if you're playing a build that's got access to a Vol skill and you could just use it all the time. Basically, every single pack, you would have your Vol skill up. Why would you use a regular skill, right? The same thing is true for Flasks. If you can, in some way, rig your build so that way you can have the bonuses from your Flasks all the way on all the time, then why wouldn't you? You are hampering your build if you don't do so. My argument to remove Flasks would be twofold. First off, it would be, of course, health, which is pretty obvious. My wrists pretty much always are yelling at me by the time I'm about midway through a play session of PoE, and definitely by the end of a play session of PoE. Sometimes that's due to flask usage, and so removing Flasks would, at least for me personally, definitely make the game more fun. But at the same time, it's not that big of a deal because for the most part, I play one-button builds. I don't play builds that particularly rely on a whole lot of Flasks because of the previous said pain in my wrists. So, I don't want to remove something that other players would enjoy and do enjoy about having their builds just because they're not cranky old men that have got tired wrists. The other argument that I've got for removing Flasks that would make Path of Exile more fun is that it would definitely make the game instantly more difficult for a lot of different builds. You would have to approach and solve different problems like utility and elemental resistances or elemental ailment resistances or immunity. Where are you going to get that utility damage from? Where are you going to get that instant response, that panic flask from? How is it that your build is going to change simply based on the removal of Flasks? I think it instantly makes the game more difficult without having to buff monsters, without having to change bosses, without having to tweak gear or change the passive tree. I think if you just remove Flasks in and of themselves, that would instantly make the game more difficult because of how much Path of Exile characters have become reliant upon the power boosts that are there from a supposedly temporary item. I think there's lots of ways that you could rework Flasks. You could put a short cooldown on Flasks and make them a bit more like a Vol skill, where after you've used it, there's essentially a built-in cooldown. That would definitely hurt some ascendancies and some builds that aren't necessarily Pathfinders, but simply use and utilize Flask effectiveness on the tree or on Delirium Cluster Jewels. So I can also see where Flasks have got a place inside Path of Exile. But at the moment, at least in compared with what they were originally designed to be, which was a temporary boost that was consumable, Flasks are no longer that. They're basically a permanent extension that you just have to constantly be pushing in order for it to be permanent. All right, the second big complaint that players had, or the second thing that players said we should remove this from the game and it would instantly make Path of Exile more fun, is releveling, or leveling through the campaign multiple times. Several different players wrote on this and wrote comments on this. One player said the leveling in the campaign every single time, once is okay, but not more. Different types of leveling tools would be cool. I personally, the enjoyed and really played the heck out of and had fun during the 1 week event where we just delve only. I really enjoyed that. Just how far can you delve and what sort of builds can you make, and how does the game change if you're just playing delve and just interacting with delve and you don't have all of these other various league expansions and league mechanics to be interacting with, and you also don't have to progress through the 10x story campaign. I had a great time with that. I made a pitch that players who want alternative leveling methods really needed to play that to show Grinding Gear Games, hey, look, there's a lot of players who will actually level in an alternate way, because I think the reason why Grinding Gear Games is so committed ultimately to playing through the campaign multiple times every time you want to play a character is that they've got data that suggests that players don't continue to play the game if they're not forced to go through the campaign. It's essentially a litmus test. It's essentially a trial. It's essentially a gateway drug. I don't know what analogy you want to use here other than to say, for whatever reason, Grinding Gear Games, and I think it's data driven. I don't think it's just, oh, they're arbitrary and GGG just hates players and hates having fun. I think they genuinely believe that once a player gets to maps, to paraphrase Chris Wilson and other philosophies and statements at Grinding Gear Games, they have players' soul. Like, once you get to maps and you're just constantly repeating and rerunning content, Grinding Gear Games has got you. You're through anything that would have otherwise turned you off to the game, and you're going to be there for a while. I think that's basically their philosophy on the campaign. Now, that being said, It's obnoxious. As somebody that has played several leagues and played Path of Exile for several years, it's obnoxious to go, hey, you know what? I league started a Templar, or I league started a Witch, or I league started a Ranger. And now you go, you know what? I want to play a Marauder, or I want to play a Duelist, or I want to play a Shadow-based character, an Ascendant character. Well, what do you need to do? Well, depending on how fast or how slow you are going through the campaign, you need to spend 4 to 12 to 20 hours going through the campaign, depending on your level of experience, depending on your level of gear to twink your character and to really push fast, and depending on your own skill, right? It is a skill to level fast, and it does take repetition, it takes practice, and it takes some talent to do. So, basically, when you're a player playing Path of Exile, if you say, hey, I see something that's a different character class than what I'm playing right now, I have to sink this amount of hours into the game in order to really go and experience that build that I'm desiring to play. Again, I think this is a data-driven thing. I think we have to, as players, we have to be somewhat sympathetic to games which are especially free to play, which rely a lot on keeping players in game and keeping players coming back to games. This is why so many different games have got daily quests or daily rewards, and then also weekly rewards or seasonal rewards. It is to incentivize players putting their time into the game, because that is oftentimes on the back end of things, on the administrative side of things, on the support raising side of things, on the financial side of things. That is where a company is able to show their investors, or is able to show based on data, if a player reaches this threshold of time played, they will spend this amount of dollars, which means we as a company can continue to operate. There is a very logical dollars and cents based approach to this. And I think that's what's driving most of the decision making at Grinding Gear Games about keeping the campaign. They're essentially worried that if you give in and you give players an alternative way of leveling, you lose out on player hours, which eventually loses out on revenue, which means people have to lose their job, and it's not good for the game in the long term, right? I know a lot of you won't want to hear that. I know that's going to be a hot take for a lot of you, and that's going to be difficult. And so feel free to push back. Feel free to disagree. Feel free to just say, oh, Iron, you're absolutely full of crap in the comments. You can feel free to do that. That's just where I think they're at on the campaign. I think it would be more fun if the campaign was gone, and that was one of the reasons why I played the Delve event, because I had fun leveling a character, not having to go and choose a bandit quest. I had more fun not having to run through the various circles of Act 8 and Act 7. I had fun not having to run through the forest 2 different times in Act 2 and Act 6. Act 6. I had fun not having to go through the Vol Pyramid. Like, seriously, do not like the Vol Pyramid. For whatever reason, in the sewers, I always get lost in the sewers. The sewers are the same basic layout all the time, but I never can find the third bust for whatever reason in Act 3. Anyway, I love not doing all of that, and I would love being able to swap characters over. It's why more and more each league I play fewer and fewer characters, and instead what I do is I'll play multiple different ascendancies inside a character subclass. So I'll just respec and change a character over. That's something that I've learned over my years in playing Path of Exile, is just to select a character and then basically find different builds inside that character's available ascendancies that are going to be strong. That's something that I've done to circumvent replaying through the campaign whenever I want to play a new character. But I recognize not everybody's going to do that, and oftentimes you're going to have a build that you're going to want to play that isn't limited to one of the other ascendancies that's on a character that you're playing. So completely get that. I would be in total favor of removing the requirement to level through the campaign for each and every single character that you're going to play. Like, I don't know what the implementation should look like. I don't know if it is an alternative leveling system and you have to level, which guarantees, at least on the back end, there's those hours that players are giving, again, to help support the game and to reach those data points where it says if player plays for X number of hours, then they're going to spend X number of dollars. But I think that would be good. And the good news is, in this discussion, is at least in some way, we're not having the campaign removed with the advent of Path of Exile 2 when it does come, but we're having an additional or an optional campaign that we can play to. Essentially, we will be able to say, do I want to go with classic POE's 10-act story campaign, going through Ray class and going through Oriath, or do I want to jump into the future and go through what at least has been announced is the 7-act campaign of Path of Exile 2, rather than the campaign of Path of Exile 1 as I level and get to the end game. Both games and both campaigns are going to lead you to the same end game. You're both going to have access to maps. You're both going to be able to progress and fight all the various end game bosses there. There's going to be no difference there. At least that's how it's been advertised for PoE 2. So on the one hand, I'm glad of that. On the other hand, it seems like Grinding Gear Games is doubling down on saying, no, you have to level through a campaign. We hear you don't like playing the campaign, so we're going to give you 2 campaigns to play through as options, rather than saying the option will be no campaigns. Eventually, we're all going to play PoE 2 enough that we don't like that campaign either, but it at least buys some time, and hopefully will give us some new scenery and some new spots and some new mechanics to run through as we level up our several characters every single league. All right, so the third thing that we're going to talk about today is kind of an amalgamation of things. So a couple of people had mentioned Reddit, so that they would remove Reddit from Path of Exile, and that would make Path of Exile instantly more fun. I would just say that's a personal choice. You don't have to look at Reddit. If you're worried about Reddit and its influence on Path of Exile, or its influence on you and your enjoyment of Path of Exile, just don't go to Reddit. Like, don't do it. Like, you might actually enjoy things more in that regard. If Reddit is causing you to lose your enjoyment of the game, then remove Reddit and just enjoy the game. On the other hand, I guess you could argue, well, it's not that I don't enjoy Reddit. I'm already off Reddit. What I don't enjoy is that Reddit is like the primary way it seems to be that news and communication and primary pieces of information are disseminated from Grinding Gear Games to the community. And I think that's a fair point. I hang out a lot on the forums, on the Grinding Gear Games forums for Path of Exile. That's where I do most of my lurking, as it were, rather than on Reddit. I think there's more informed discussion. I just think there's more discussion on the forums for Path of Exile than on Reddit, just in general, right? In general, because Reddit is essentially a vote aggregator site for content. Whereas Path of Exile, the forums are not that. They're set up in a mechanically different way. And so there's different content that's on there. There's different discussions that are on there. So I don't know. If you don't like Reddit, maybe try hanging out on the forums if you're looking for other spots to read and engage with other players. Also, I'm going to give a shout out to our own community here in G3. I really love our community here in G3, and I love the way how we have discussions in the comments of each of our various discussion videos. I love the way how people conduct themselves in our discussions. And so I would say, if you're really worried about Reddit and it being toxic, or the forums and it being toxic, I got to say, we do a really good job around here. You all do a really good job around here of basically providing helpful and thoughtful feedback, discussion, critiques, and engagement on various topics about Path of Exile. It's one of the things that I've loved seeing here in the community, right here at G3 over the last couple of years, is that we've not only, of course, grown in size, but we've also, I want to say, this is going to sound really cheesy, but we've grown in the level of our discussion to the point where people are learning things by hanging out in the comment section of different discussions here, right here at G3. I really like that. That's one of the things that I like about the forums. It's one of the things I like about Reddit. I like going and learning something new, or being provoked to think about things in a different way. And I like that we as a community are encouraging and provoking one another to do that right here on YouTube. McCoy says, I would remove the excess amount of unneeded clicking and integrate some macros configs into the game. Now, this is going to be a touchy subject. There's a lot of different opinions on this. I personally do not want Path of Exile to ever come close to being World of Warcraft. I do not play World of Warcraft. I have played it in the past, but I do not play World of Warcraft now. I like Path of Exile. I like a lot of what it's doing. I like a lot of the gameplay, the features, and the UI, believe it or not. I actually enjoy a lot of the things that are inside Path of Exile as currently constituted. I feel like once you open up that magic box, that Pandora's box, that genie's bottle of allowing different macros into the game, you essentially turn into a macro manager, and the game itself becomes a macro manager, and who's got the best macros and who's doing what when, and well, you need this macro and you need that. And Path of Exile already has that to a certain extent. It's already got all of these different tools. Okay, let's think about this for just a minute. Do you want to trade in Path of Exile? All right. What UI system are you using as your overhaul for trade? Are you farming in Path of Exile? Are you killing monsters and hoping loot drops for you? Okay. What loot filter are you using? Okay, hey, is it hard for you to see your mouse when you're playing Path of Exile because there's a ton of screen clutter? Okay, are you using YOLO mouse or something else to actually augment it so that way you can see where it is that you're actually clicking? When you're leveling up, are you using any of the approved tools that you can use in order to level up and help you? Whether that's just looking at a chart that tells you, in general, the door is on the bottom left, and in general, the next area is on the bottom right, or is there something else that you're using? Again, that's legal and allowable. Like, Path of Exile already has all of these different tools at its disposal. Oh, do you want to craft? Okay, are you using any of the numerous crafting websites in order to look up and how to target crafting things? I feel like Path of Exile is already this game. Like when I'm teaching and showing and introducing new players into Path of Exile, it is overwhelming for them because there is the game Path of Exile, and then there is all of the accompaniment that also goes with the game, and that just keeps like growing and growing and growing, and you just need more stuff. There's more tools because there's new mechanics, and you need a chart for betrayal, and you need a cheat sheet for a lab, and you need to look at POE lab if you're ascending your character, and you need there's so much. And it's one of the things that I love about Path of Exile. I can feel myself smiling like as I'm talking about it. There's so much that's fun about that. But if you allow macros into the game and you say, hey, let's really automate a lot of these otherwise, menial tasks that we wouldn't want to do, it's a Pandora's box, and the whole game would change. The game in a year or two would look vastly different to what it is now. That's going to be my argument for that. But for a lot of you, I recognize that it would make it more fun. Lodrick says, I would remove the layers upon layers of RNG. So I've got good news and bad news for you, I guess, Lodrick, on this. On the one hand, you actually make the argument to aim for things that are targetable, that are farmable in specific areas. On the one hand, there is good news for that. They're called divination cards, right? Divination cards do drop in specific areas and do allow you to essentially farm for certain things. If you play SSF, then you will learn that there are certain zones, certain things drop in, and it will inform the way how you play the game, and you'll be working your way towards something rather than just relying upon layers of RNG. So that's the good news. There are some things that you can be farming in certain ways. The bad news is layers upon layers upon layers of RNG is Grinding Gear Games' pillar of game philosophy. That is the foundation of what they believe retains players, attracts players, and grows and sustains the game. They believe that every time you're playing Path of Exile, you ought to essentially be pulling on a slot machine, because layers and layers and layers of RNG ought to be coming into effect, which build up to, in their mind and in their philosophy and in their research, build up to a payoff or not a payoff. The vast majority of the time, it's not a payoff. And so you are waiting for that time where you kill a monster and a mirror drops, or you kill a boss and an exalt drops, or you complete a map and you get that one particular thing that you were looking for, or a div card drops and it's something exactly that you were looking for, etc. Every time you are interacting in a zone that gets randomly generated. Every time you're using a weapon or an item or an armor that's been randomly generated. Every time you're going into a new party that is going to encounter new monsters that have been randomly generated. Everything in Path of Exile is about that layers of RNG on top of other RNG. So I hope that's not bad news for you. If you were to take that away from Path of Exile, though, it would fundamentally change the game across the board. So I'd love to hear more thoughts down below from many of you if you've got ideas about how to essentially maybe not take away layers of RNG, but maybe limit it, or maybe expand upon that idea of divination cards where there's an RNG element to things, but there's also something that you can feel like you're progressing towards. Thanks so much for joining us for today's discussion. What is one thing that you would remove from PoE to instantly make it more fun? And why would you want that thing removed? Can you explain that in your comment down below? Also, how would PoE be more fun without that one thing? Take away that one thing and then give an example of why it is that Path of Exile would be improved through the removal of that one thing. Thanks so much once again for joining us for today's discussion, and I hope today is the day that a Mirror of Calandra drops for you.